Hello, this is Tripod, the audio advertising podcast. Now, we give you 6 minutes on an audio medium that has grown exponentially over the last few years. Podcasts. Okay, so our third category of audio media is, of course, podcasts, and you're listening to one right now. One of the fastest growing sectors of the audio market, Matt. Why is it growing so fast?
Well, I think we've kind of touched on it a bit in terms of just access to it, just general awareness of podcasts, the talent that's involved now, and people discovering more and more. There's always a gateway, a personality that might get you involved, and then you understand that there's a lot more content out there for yourself and for your own niche interests. And, you know, in terms of what advertisers can do in podcasts, across which different formats they can bring to the medium is, you know, there's obviously standard spot advertising,
which is pre-roll, mid-roll, or post-roll, which means at the beginning, middle, or end of a podcast, for those who don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And every podcast will have advertisers within them usually. And, you know, again, I think we'll talk a bit about the creative of that, about, you know, not necessarily porting your commercial radio ad into a podcast because it's a completely different environment, but I'm sure we'll get to that. So, you know, you can generate scale across a podcast network by using it almost in the same way that you would use a linear radio or digital audio network, being able to target listeners based on data who are engaging with podcasts and generate scale across a podcast network in that way. But then there are other ways you can use podcasts in terms of speaking to listeners, and that's through host-read sponsorships. And that is defined as, again, in the pre, mid, or post, next to spot advertising as well. And this is where the host of the show will deliver a 60 to 90 second host read talking about a brand that's sponsoring their show this week. These are delivered dynamically, so you can buy on a tenancy basis. So you can have a campaign run for 4 weeks, which can be switched on and off, optimized accordingly if you need to. And it's not just when that audio is dynamically inserted at the point of stream or download, you are sponsoring that show for the new episodes that are being released that week, and also every other episode that's previously been released. So if you're listening to episode 200 or episode 2, if you download that during the campaign period that a brand is on air for, you will hear that sponsorship message in either the pre, the mid, or the post, whichever one it is you've bought. And then also you can do bigger and better things, such as we do branded segments, and this is where it could be a 3 to 4 minute piece of audio in the mid-roll of a show. And this is where you get the talent and the host to actually be using the product that you could be promoting. So, you know, they could be test driving a car, or they could be taste testing a drink. These types of bits of audio you would get that produced outside of the studio environment. So it's a bit more engaging to the listener. And because it's 3 to 4 minutes long, you've got a lot more flexibility in terms of what content you're putting into that. Again, the flip side of that is you would only really plan to run those for 1 week only, because if someone's a fan of the show and they're hearing that same 3 to 4 minutes every week, it's going to quickly tire out. So, but it does deliver a spike for a campaign. So, you know, there's those things that you can buy into, and that's a real growth area or an exciting area for a brand to be in, because they get to potentially work with talent that they would never be exposed to normally. And then we can go even further than that. You can do things like a branded episode, where you can work with a host or a show where you take over an entire episode of the show. You could get the designer of the car to come and sit with them for a half an hour, and they talk about, you know, the process of making the vehicle, those types of things. So, you know, again, it's an exciting space, and you do have to be mindful of kind of budget levels and production levels, because that's something to think about when you're engaging with talent in that way.
We talked about podcasts being a lean-in listen, and that element of intimacy and trust between host and listener. Does that mean the element of repetition we talked about in terms of linear radio is less relevant?
I think you've got to be careful in terms of how often you would deploy your message within a show, because you've got to think that if if someone's listening to a podcast, they're probably listening to that week's episode, and they'll probably listen to it once for that week. So the next time they might have exposure to your sponsorship message, for example, in that show would be when they're listening next week. And then the creative that they've recorded for a host-read sponsorship can have a bit of longevity. It's not going to tire out as quickly, whereas something you might hear on commercial radio, on linear radio quite a lot is you do get that repetition of advertising, and that bears into the frequency of it and the strength of that medium. But in the podcast space, you've got to be mindful that potentially people aren't going to hear it as often as they would versus other media. We always recommend that if you are sponsoring a show, and if you're sponsoring it for 4 weeks, then your one sponsorship read for that 4 weeks is enough. Anything longer than that, you probably will want to change it up, because audiences will get used to the messages.
Octave's Matt Rouse on the many ways you can use podcasts. Next up, we focus on the importance of audio creative. Hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss that. And for more, visit trisonic.co.uk.